Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to talk about the effect of industrialization, nationalism, and European imperialism on the Muslim world. We're going to try to talk about the Muslim world while leaving out the Ottomans, which is going to be really problematic, and I'm probably going to slip up and say Ottomans when I actually mean Egyptians on occasion. But this is the problem with trying to deal with these things separately in distinct units when all this stuff is connected together. So let's dive in and talk about this and just wait for me to make a series of mistakes. So here are our objectives for today. Let's dive in and talk about this. Egypt is technically part of the Ottoman Empire. And so, because of this, of course, uh, Egypt is an Ottoman state, but they've also been in the British sphere of influence for a while because, of course, Britain wanted to develop their colony in India. And so, the Isthmus of Suez was incredibly important for the British. And they were invaded by Napoleon during the Napoleonic Wars in an attempt to hurt the British and cut them off from their Indian colonies. Obviously, during this whole time, the British or the Egyptians were technically an Ottoman state, but at the same time, they had their own army, had their own customs, had their own traditions, things like that. So Napoleon defeated the Mamelukes and brought a bunch of the reforms of the French Revolution. Your constitutional government, your secular education, your modern scientific methods to Egypt. And after Napoleon was defeated by British and Ottoman forces, Ottoman rulers, or Egyptian rulers, this is going to happen repeatedly, Egyptian rulers like Muhammad Ali started to continue these reforms. He's going to keep building a modern European style army and navy. He's going to shift production of Ottoman agriculture to cash crops in order to make more money. And although this did make Egypt more dependent on foreign sources of grain, it significantly increased their income and allowed him to finance his own private army, which he then used to defeat the Ottomans in combat. And although he still remained a vassal of the Ottoman Empire, in practice he was mostly independent. And during the various wars of the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire would have to ask the Sultan of Egypt to help them militarily. So here's the rule of Muhammad Ali in Egypt. Read, respond to questions, and we'll move on. Egypt also attempted to build a canal across the Isthmus of Suez during this time period. Obviously, the Suez Passage between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea was one of the more important sort of overland trade routes connecting these two great waterways, and a water route from Europe to Asia would generate significant income for everyone. And so European countries were very eager to have this happen. And honestly, Muhammad Ali was also very interested in this because it would generate tons of money for Egypt. In order to finance this canal, he would take out significant loans from European countries, which would then further tie Egypt to a variety of different European countries, eventually leading the British to step up and start exerting significant influence over Egypt. Here's the British describing why they felt like they needed to acquire Egypt. So take a moment, pause, and read. And by going into so much debt, the Egypt became a de facto British protectorate. They were still technically part of the Ottoman Empire, and certainly not politically directly connected to the British. But because British loans financed so much of the Suez Canal, and because Egyptian rulers struggled to pay those loans, Egypt became tied to the British more so than even the Ottoman Empire, which they had specific political treaties connecting them to. I understand that this is confusing. In other parts of Asia, Afghanistan, we need to at least introduce them. Afghanistan has always been a territory sort of in between larger empires, in between Persia, India, China, Russia, places like that. During this time period, the Russians and the British, who were occupying India at this time, start to squeeze Afghanistan with the goal of taking over more of their territory. Here we see the Russian bear and the British lion eyeing the Afghan people. The problem with Afghanistan, or the problem with controlling Afghanistan, is geographically they're incredibly difficult to control. And so the Afghan people are very sort of isolated within these little enclaves because of the difficult geography of the territory of Afghanistan. And they're very, very capable of using that geography to isolate foreign forces and set up ambushes. And so here's the account of the Hill of Bones and the defeat of the British. So take a moment, pause, and read. And the basic message that the British learned here, which is a lesson that lots of other people are going to learn, is that militarily controlling Afghanistan is, in the end, probably impossible. Persia is going to fall under the sway of the British during this time period. You, of course, remember that the Persians are an ancient society going all the way back to Cyrus the Great and the Achaemenid Empire. We've also had a variety of other Persian empires that we've talked about. Your Sassanid Empire. And then the last one was the Safavids. We talked about the Safavids with our gunpowder empires. So they've been declining and they fell in 1747. But Persia, at this point, oil was discovered within parts of what is today Persia. And so a British company called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company is going to start encroaching on the oil-rich areas of Persia in the Persian Gulf. This type of economic imperialism is going to be very similar to what we saw with the British East India Company taking over India, with them setting up their own private army, setting up Persian leaders that are sort of friendly to them, using them through indirect rule to control these areas. And we're going to see another battle between the British and the Russians for control over this area. In the end, this battle is won by the British. They're going to get most of these oil concessions, but tension between these two groups are going to continue, and especially as Russia is going to really grow in power in the aftermath of World War I, we're going to see continued fights over control over Middle Eastern oil resources, mostly between European countries and economic imperialism from the Europeans. The partition of Persia between the British and the Russians theoretically established this neutral zone and gave the Russians control over the northern parts of Persia, but in reality, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company is going to dominate the Persian neutral area, and the British are going to be the main policymakers in Persia, or what is today called Iran. So here is the Persian cat being dominated again by the British lion and the Russian bear, and we see the same sort of trends, European money taking over Middle Eastern countries. In North Africa, the French had been controlling a lot of this territory. The last time we talked about North Africa, we talked about sort of the Barbary states leading to tension with the new United States. These Barbary states were theoretically independent Muslim kingdoms that were also technically part of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman power structure is difficult to get into, so you probably don't need to know that piece. But one of the things that we did not talk about is the French had taken over part of northern Africa under the reign of Charles X. When Charles X, after having ascended to the throne in the aftermath of the death of the French Revolution and the death of his brother Louis XVIII, he invaded North Africa in an attempt to mobilize the French people behind him and establish nationalism. The French would then eventually take over more of North Africa, and at the Berlin Conference would be given this huge territory called French East Africa, which is going to control a lot of the Sahara Desert and these sort of Arab Muslim states. The French are going to institute very particular policies in order to keep the North African people pliable. So take a moment and pause and read this, then we'll move forward. And the North African people are going to fight back against the French. We're going to see more or less continuous resistance movements attacking French forces and attempting to stop the French from exerting as much control as they could. The French are still going to control a significant portion of North Africa and East Africa, but they're never going to be able to exert much political power because of constant resistance from the African peoples. This has become it became enough of a part of our popular culture that there's actually a hilarious comic strip called Croc, in which it's about French occupation of North Africa and their torturing of North African people. Look how funny it is that he's torturing him or threatening to torture him in order to have him reveal where the other rebels are. So, haha. So that brings us to the end of European encroachment into the Middle East. We see more methods of indirect control here as opposed to direct control. And this, of course, is going to really influence the development of the region, especially as the Ottoman Empire fatally collapses in the aftermath of World War I. So that's a story that we're going to tell next time. This brings to a close our European imperialism movement. And so when we come back, we're going to talk about the rise of tensions and the outbreak of World War I. So thank you for listening.